Hello, I'm Jody Orr, and welcome to the first half of my presentation on discourse analysis in written text. So, a brief definition of discourse analysis is it is a method for describing the ideas and the relations present in a text. It provides a means to more systematically engage in the descriptive analysis and comparison of written text. So the translation of that definition is that discourse analysis gives researchers a way to better understand how and why readers read one type of text versus another based on the genre, purpose, and style of text. So how they understand those different texts differently. So you might ask yourself, why does this matter? Why are written texts worthy of analysis? So if you are a literacy researcher, the data that you can extract with discourse analysis is really central to understanding how students read and comprehend what they're reading, which is a cornerstone of literacy theory. If students aren't achieving comprehension as they read, there is no point in reading, basically. So there's a lot of vocabulary in discourse analysis, and I'm going to define some for you so that it makes sense when you read about discourse analysis in your future studies. When researchers examine text based on their global level of relations, they're looking at structure of that text, basically, rhetorical structure. So take, for instance, a narrative story like a fairy tale. There's a real formula to those types of pieces of writing. And they include a main character or a protagonist, a problem that needs solving, for instance, a princess held captive by a dragon, and then the main character or protagonist, who can tend to be a prince, who cooks, cleans, and helps the kids with their homework, who solves that problem that this particular other character is experiencing. And then finally, there's an ending that's generally scripted as they all lived happily ever after. These are all elements that exist within the global level of relations in a narrative text. Coherence, another vocabulary word worth understanding. It is sort of the logical glue that allows readers to move easily and clearly from one idea to the next. So to achieve coherence in a text, writers usually turn to conjunctions, adverbs, and prepositional phrases and clauses that function as adverbs to hold the writing together and give it meaning as it flows from one topic to the next. So what coherence looks like on a page, there's 4 elements: temporal, additive, causal, and adversative. So all 4 of these components make up coherence. Coherent writing uses these devices to connect each idea between sentences and paragraphs. If a piece of writing lacks coherence, it's really hard to follow. So an example of a temporal event within a piece of coherent writing is when there's logical steps, an ordered sequence, like, for instance, in a math equation, you add 2 plus 2 equals 4. So that's a logical sequence of events. An additive, where there is a main idea that's followed by supporting details. A causal event, where an antecedent, something already exists, and it is followed by another event that causes an action. So, for instance, a scientist heats water in a beaker, and then the events that follow are boiling and bubbling. And finally, an adversative, which is when you juxtapose contradictory information within a sentence. For instance, the rope was thin, but it was strong. So the adversative conjunction in that sentence is the word but. Okay, more vocabulary. Discourse markers. These are really important because they are really words that help link phrases and act as sentence connectors within a passage. They are words like however, although, and nevertheless. They're really important because they kind of act as glue that bind together a piece of writing and make it stick together and make sense. Without sufficient discourse markers in a piece of writing, it just doesn't seem logically constructed, and there doesn't seem to be a connection between sentences and paragraphs that are obvious to readers. More vocabulary. Connectives. Connectives are words that you find in a passage like furthermore, because, moreover, in addition. And they also do the same thing. They help with a logical flow of ideas and texts and alert the reader to relationships between those sentences and paragraphs. They can be prepositions, conjunctions, or adverbs. And again, they are words that help a reader basically better comprehend what they're reading. Okay, signals. Also, a literary device that writers use, especially in informative text, things that you read when you were in junior high and high school, um, in science, in social studies, and they're loaded with these devices to help guide you through a reading. They can be titles, headings, subheadings, bolded words, underlined, italicized words, anything that draws your attention to that text and gives you basically instructions on what's important in the text and what you need to read to understand it in a comprehensive manner. Okay, so why use discourse analysis when we have readability measures like Lexile? Well, according to literacy researchers, these readability measures don't really give researchers an accurate sense of ideas and interrelations of a text that really are necessary to achieve true comprehension. So, literacy researchers came up with a different construct to describe how readable a text is. And these are called propositions. Um, Basically, a proposition is composed of simple concepts, otherwise known as atomic propositions. And a propositional scheme is one in which atomic propositions are arranged. The drawing on the right side of this slide is an example of using propositions to analyze text. This propositional scheme shown on the slide consists of a predicate and one or more arguments, which are diagrammed. It's based on two passages that begin the chapter of the book that I researched, and they are written in two different formats about the same subject, which was the opening of a nuclear power plant on the Tupelo River and the subsequent environmental impact to that riparian ecosystem. So, when you use discourse analysis and propositions to analyze a text, you basically take simple concepts, predicates, and one or more arguments, and you diagram them. By doing this, the proposition basically breaks down the state, event, or action within a text, and it helps researchers determine the complexity of its structure. So, another way to do this more simply and practically is to use a text base. So it does the same thing that was done on the slide previous, but it does it more simply. So really the important thing to remember when looking at propositions and text base is that they allow researchers to examine texts in terms of their structure, which are, according to a proposition, predicates, arguments, and simple concepts, and the ease with which those propositions and coherence of a text are achieved. And that really helps researchers determine how complicated and really ultimately how readable they are for students. So again, using a text base versus that propositional scheme that you saw on the previous slide is just more practical. It's easier to read. It's just quicker for researchers. So in this particular text base, the object of this passage is the new nuclear power plant. The time is the spring of 1999, and the place is in the town of Breggsville. So what happens when a reader blends their existing knowledge with a text base? Well, a mental model happens. And what a mental model is taking into account that reader's background knowledge and what they know about content, and then how it interacts with a text base to create something new and add to a reader schema. So at this point, you're probably asking, how do all these words and this concept of discourse analysis apply to a classroom setting? If researchers give students writing prompts based on a reading, And then they diagram those written responses with propositions. They can better discern a student's comprehension of the elements of that reading that they just read based on their writing about it. So this is called basically recall of a text. And when you ask a student to tell you, well, what do you remember specifically about what you just read? They write down a passage or a text, and they present it to a teacher who then, or researcher, who then looks at it to see what they really got out of it. Statistically, students generally, depending on the genre, especially with expository writing, only remember about 25 to 40% of the predicate propositions from the text space they just read. So researchers use something called meaning preserving criterion, and that helps them decide how much a student really remembered. And then they ask themselves, does this recall that they wrote capture the essence and the meaning of a passage? If it does, then the student is credited with really having deeply remembered the passage. The trick with all of this is that people have really different ways of recalling passages. And according to Goldman and Wiley, people will combine multiple sentences and produce summary statements. They combine ideas from parts of a different sentences, and they make accurate and inaccurate inferences about the text. They express basically what they remember in different ways. So when researchers analyze written discourse that students create, they have to keep in mind that the knowledge of that student's domain, their background knowledge, is really a factor in their understanding of how much they remember and understand about a passage. So to ensure scientific soundness in discourse analysis, researchers have to come up with a coding scheme. And that's a way of interpreting from inner rater to inner rater what is worth noting in a passage and what its complexity levels are. So because writing is such a subjective activity, you have to remove that subjectivity as much as possible when you are analyzing through discourse analysis. You have to come up with a coding scheme that categorizes behavior so that raters can use it over and over again reliably when they're observing that behavior. And that's what scientific soundness is in discourse analysis. You want to remove the subjectivity of that analysis. So how does discourse analysis help us understand better our issues in literacy education? Writing is a really difficult cognitive task. And since reading and writing are interconnected, if a student struggles to read, then they'll probably have difficulty writing as well. Discourse analysis helps researchers grasp more effectively and assess complexity in text structures and understand how students interpret those texts and write about them. Using discourse analysis to study what students comprehend in the structure of a text can help us better align our instruction in reading and writing accordingly and really choose texts that are going to be just more easy to read and more easy to understand for students, and in effect, actually easy to write about as well. Thank you for reading or watching my presentation, and I promise that the next half will not be as dense in vocabulary.